Hi Placemakers, Rob Tullis here with the fourth of 5 short videos dealing with placemaking technique. If you've watched the introduction to this series, you know that I'm preaching that architects and urban designers should put place before project and that they should be conscious of the spaces between urban buildings as a setting for human activities, and that their building designs can help define these spaces and enhance the sense of place felt in them. Our question is how? How are designers to put place before project in order to help transform space into place? What are some techniques? In talks 2 and 3, I demonstrated a technique for planning the spaces between urban buildings by looking at precedents as a referential point of departure. Here in talk 4, I'll demonstrate a technique for using Mannerism in designing the building facades that define and face city spaces, and I'll focus on 2 buildings in the University Park at MIT project designed by Coder Kim and Associates. So let's get into the design of those buildings now. University Park at MIT was developed by Forest City and sponsored by MIT on land that they assembled from a former wire and cable manufacturer's facilities and a number of other small contiguous industrial properties. It was intended by MIT as an incubator for the computer and biotech businesses started by faculty and researchers. Coder Kim's master plan won a PA award in 1982, was approved by the city of Cambridge, Mass. In '85, won a Boston Society of Architects Urban Design Award in 1991, and a ULI Award for Excellence in 2004. The master plan extends a street and block pattern through the available land and places interconnected open spaces along a major and minor axis so that the various parks and courtyards read like voids carved from the mass of the surrounding urban fabric. The buildings are intended to shape the spaces between them, not to appear as isolated objects. Note that the master plan's density was overlaid onto mostly vacant land. The aerial photo at the upper left shows the site after most of it was cleared of various one-story buildings. But in the surrounding lots, you can see that there wasn't much here. The university's, developers, and master plan's vision of a dense city precinct was far more urban than similar developments planned elsewhere at the time. It's a city district, not an office park. At the center of the master plan, you see a large park. I've highlighted it in green. The first 2 buildings that we'll look at, numbers 38 and 64 Sidney Street, are directly east of the park, fronting it and the district's main street. In the 5th talk in this series, I'll analyze number 88 Sidney Street directly to their south. Number 38 Sidney Street, known as the Clark Building and built in 1989, and number 64 Sidney, known as the Richards Building and built in 1990, were the first 2 buildings constructed and were intended to be demonstrations of the design guidelines that cover all buildings here. Not only do they define Sidney Street and the east edge of the Central Park, but they also define the main cross-axis and secondary space known as Lansdowne Quadrangle. In the aerial photo, you see them at the heart of the district, surrounded by all the buildings that have come later. In blue, I've outlined a building not yet built in this photo, but which now completes the park's enclosure. Here they are in a photo taken immediately after their construction, with the street trees just planted and the park landscaping not yet started. In this photo, their facade organization is more clearly evident. Note how these front facades are treated as just that, facades. Planar elements with a defined base-middle-top organization and repetitive frame-like bays. And note how they are bilaterally symmetrical about the gap between them, drawing attention to the pedestrian cross-axis, the second most important thoroughfare in the district. Also note a few architectural tricks employed here, how the narrow outermost windows in each bay are recessed to emphasize the figure quality of the middle windows and the object quality of the piers. And note how the facades don't end at a solid brick pier as you might expect them to, but rather that the glass window plane appears to extend out laterally from behind the piers, both at the extreme north and south ends of each building and at the central gap. In fact, the last base piers on the regular rhythm have become detached from the buildings proper. This is Mannerism, the manipulation of expected architectural norms to produce a compositional tension or instability that emphasizes solid and spatial relationships and draws attention to the variant elements. So here the building walls are not thought of as skin that encloses internal functions. They are thought of as planes that face and define public open spaces. And they're individualized, not treated as wallpaper. Coder Kim also established a hierarchy of facades to face different streets and spaces, and thus to further define their hierarchies within the grid. At Sidney Street, they create the most important facade, what I'll call the A-wall. It is composed of a series of grand order piers that have a scale appropriate to the park space that they enclose. Coder Kim spaces those piers on a regular rhythm that I've indicated with the numbers 1 through 9. A few more Mannerist tricks here. At the center of the composition, as I've already noted, the number 1 piers are run past the ends of the two buildings, detaching from them to form a gateway at the Gap's plaza. Directly adjacent to these detached piers, I've drawn blue arrows to mark the half-bay minor piers that usually occur in the middle of a factory-like window, but now suddenly become used to help turn the corner of the building. The second full bays in from the Gap center line hold the building entries. I've marked them with the red lines 3 and 4. These bays are given emphasis not by varying the piers, which owe their fealty to the scale of the park and thus shouldn't be changed, but by fully recessing the entire window, not just the narrow flankers, and by adding a 2-story tall banner bracket above the door. And finally, note the number 9 piers, the farthest left on 38 Sidney and the farthest right on 64. Because the site of number 64 is longer than that of 38, the pier on the extreme left forms the corner of number 38, while the one on the extreme right plays the same game as at the Gap. Again, here it's the half-bay minor pier that's used to turn the corner of the building, making number 64's facade symmetrical at its ends. Here's a closer view of the A-wall and these two buildings at the Gap. I think this shows how the facades really work to strongly define the street face, yet make something special happen at the Gap and at the building's entries within the rigorous system of piers and bays. The A-wall has gained enough architectural importance through these Mannerist manipulations to fulfill its primary role, not as the building's container, but as the edge of a major public street and park space. Note also here that Coder Kim articulates the A-wall as having a depth by establishing an implied 10-foot zone of metal and glass behind the piers. I say implied because it doesn't really exist. This zone has nothing to do with the internal program, which is all homogeneous leased office and lab space back to the elevator core. Here's an even closer photo of the central Gap. You can clearly see the ends of the 10-foot zone of depth that separates the A-wall, the street wall, from the mass of the building. At the lower right, I've indicated this implied zone in blue and the A-wall in red. This zone is imposed on the building for a couple of Mannerist reasons. First, it sets the A-wall apart as a grandly scaled independent element, giving it a heightened importance commensurate with the A-wall's position in the urban grid. And second, it gives the A-wall's piers the independence needed to break free of the building mass and to form the plaza's gateway. Note also, while we have a plan in front of us, the lobby configurations in which the rear entries are offset from the front entries. They've been jogged inwards to face the Lansdowne quadrangle. Again, the shaping of the building components is driven by urban context, not by internal pragmatics. Finally, let's look at the extreme northern end of this zone of depth at 38 Sidney Street and its extreme southern end at 64 Sidney. At 38 Sidney, where the major column turns the building's corner, the zone is revealed and objectified by running it past the pier and articulating it as a formal projecting window. At 64 Sidney, where the mid-bay minor pier is used because of the longer building length, the same trick used at the Gap has been repurposed. At both extreme ends, the identity of the zone and of the A-wall is clearly established. The A-wall is also given prominence by its contrast with an intentionally less sophisticated B-wall. You can see the B-wall at left and right of this photo. This is the rear of 64 Sidney. The left side here faces Lansdowne Quadrangle and the service street. The right side faces the plaza at the cross-axis Gap. The sides and rear of the buildings are sheathed in facades composed as simpler, flat walls with punched openings. Raised string courses are the only architectural articulation here, and they are employed to keep your eye moving horizontally along the B-walls to the corners where the action is. While most of the rear walls face a service street, the inner 30 feet of each face that secondary public space on the cross-axis, Lansdowne Quadrangle. So here, the B wall gets separated from simply wrapping the corner with a vertical slot, and it gets manipulated to pick up the characteristics borrowed from the A wall. The architecture is telling us that this space is important, not as important as the Central Park, but important enough to be defined by a special face. This is where those offset rear entries are located. Again, with the exception of the ground floor entry, all of this Mannerist manipulation is context-oriented only. There's nothing special in the floor plan or use that prompts these moves. The entire building is a speculative research building intended to be leased to many different companies over its life. What remains constant is the exterior context. At the southeast corner of 64 Sidney's Service Street is a small roundabout intersection called Pilgrim Circle. At Pilgrim Circle, the B walls are completely interrupted and replaced by the insertion of a special composition, a C wall, whose whole purpose is to define and give distinct identity to the circular urban space. Note how Susie Kim, who I remember laboring over every Mannerist move here, separates the wall from the building with glass slots, and then runs its piers completely past the corners of the mass, which is held back at the attic story to make the illusion of a detached element complete. You can see how effective this approach is when you contrast it with the way another architect treated his side of the circle. He simply wrapped his facade around the corner and into the circle, thinking of it as wallpaper that contains the building mass, but not as an independent element with a more important urban role to fill. He makes larger window compositions on the upper stories, but the wall is the same. Without treatment of the entire semicircular wall as an independent element, there's no ability to extend it past the building edges. As you can see at the upper left, when viewed from outside the circle, Susie's winged ends set up a threshold condition that heightens your sense of passing into a distinct space. Had there been a related portal element on the other building, the threshold would have been completed. So, through the magic of PowerPoint graphics, I've sketched one in. Note that the blonde building at the end, number 88 Sidney Street, doesn't have a corresponding semicircular indent. In the 12 years between 1990 and 2002, when this building was built, floor area pressures expanded the footprint of 88 Sidney, and Pilgrim Circle turned into Pilgrim Semicircle. The architect of the 88 Sidney Street building, who was me, did his best to adopt the B-wall manipulation technique to formally face the semicircle. I centered the air handlers and the loading dock door, picked up on the fenestration tiers, and objectified the central bay window, and set the attic story back within an otherwise continuous flat wall. In Talk 5 of this series on technique, I'll conclude by looking at the rest of 88 Sidney and show you how I used Mannerism to put place before project. Thank you.